It was supposed to be the perfect getaway. Just me and my closest friends, miles away from the noise and chaos of everyday life. We had all been craving an escape, somewhere far from the city where we could unwind, disconnect, and maybe drink a little too much under the stars. The idea of camping in the middle of nowhere seemed like the perfect solution. We found the spot after a few hours of driving. A dense, secluded forest nestled between mountains with a crystal-clear lake that shimmered like glass. The kind of place you see in travel brochures, promising tranquility and peace. But the thing about places like this, they hide things in the shadows. From the moment we set up camp, there was an odd vibe, like the trees were watching us. I couldn't shake the feeling, but I didn't mention it to the others. I figured it was just nerves, or maybe the stress of the week finally catching up with me. As night fell, we huddled around the campfire, the crackling flames offering a small, comforting light against the vast darkness. The conversation flowed easily at first. Jokes, stories, the usual banter. But as the night wore on, the atmosphere began to shift. It started with the sound. At first, it was just the typical noises you'd expect from a forest at night. Rustling leaves, the occasional snap of a twig, maybe an animal scurrying through the underbrush. But then, we heard something else. A low, almost imperceptible hum, like a distant voice carried on the wind. We all paused, straining our ears, but the sound was gone as quickly as it had come. "Did you guys hear that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. The others exchanged glances, some shaking their heads, others muttering something about the wind. We tried to laugh it off, but the fire didn't seem as warm as it had a moment ago. A few hours later, I stepped away from the group, needing a moment alone. I walked to the edge of the camp where the trees formed a wall of blackness. The moon was high, casting an eerie glow over the clearing, but beyond that, nothing but darkness. That's when I saw it. A shadow, darker than the night around it, standing just within the tree line. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, maybe a tree stump or a bush, but then it moved, just slightly, like it was shifting its weight from one foot to the other. My breath caught in my throat. "Ken, who's there?" I called out, my voice sounding much braver than I felt. No answer. The figure didn't move, it just stood there, as if waiting for something. I took a step closer, but the figure seemed to melt back into the darkness, disappearing without a sound. My heart was pounding as I returned to the group. I didn't mention what I saw. What could I say? That I saw a shadow in the woods? They'd laugh, tell me I was seeing things, that it was probably just an animal. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Something was out there, and it was watching us. The fire crackled and popped, bending up a spray of glowing embers that briefly lit up the faces of my friends. They were laughing, caught up in some story I wasn't really paying attention to. My mind was still in the woods, replaying the moment when I saw that shadow. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the image from my mind. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing. The darkness and my imagination were playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something was off. There was a heaviness in the air, like the forest was holding its breath, waiting. As the night dragged on, we all started to feel it. The laughter became forced, conversations died out, and the silence of the woods seemed to press in closer. Every so often, someone would glance over their shoulder, peering into the darkness, as if expecting something to be there. Then we heard it again, sound from earlier. This time it was louder, more distinct. A soft, rhythmic whispering just beyond the fire's light. It wasn't the wind, and it definitely wasn't an animal. It sounded human. "What the hell is that?" Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with fear. She wasn't the only one. We all stood up, straining to hear, trying to make sense of the sound. But the more we listened, the less it made sense. It was like a conversation, but the words were jumbled, as if someone was speaking in a language we couldn't understand. "Probably some weird echo," Chris said, trying to sound confident, but his voice trembled. "Sound carries funny in the woods, right?" No one answered him. We were all too focused on the whispering, which seemed to be circling us now, moving through the trees like a predator stalking its prey. "I don't like this," Benna muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe we should just pack up and leave." But leaving in the middle of the night wasn't an option. The nearest town was hours away, and navigating those winding forest roads in the dark, asking for trouble. So, we did the only thing we could do. We retreated to our tents, hoping that the flimsy nylon walls would offer some protection from whatever was out there. Lying in my tent, the whispering seemed louder, closer. It was as if the voices were right outside, just inches away from where I lay. My heart pounded in my chest, and I squeezed my eyes shut, willing myself to fall asleep. But sleep didn't come. The whispering went on and on, until it felt like it was seeping into my mind, filling it with strange fragmented thoughts. At some point, I must have drifted off, but my sleep was restless, filled with twisted, confusing dreams. I kept seeing that shadowy figure, only now it was standing over me, watching, waiting. And then, just as I was about to wake up, a voice whispering my name. I woke with a start, drenched in sweat, the voice still echoing in my ears. For a moment, I lay there, too afraid to move, listening. The whispering was gone, but the night was still, unnaturally quiet. That's when I noticed it. My tent was unzipped. Not all the way, just a few inches, enough to let in a sliver of cold air. I stared at the gap, my mind racing. I hadn't unzipped it. I was sure of that. I reached out slowly, trembling, and pulled the zipper back up. But as I did, I caught a glimpse of something. Faint, glowing symbol drawn in the dirt right outside my tent. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen. Twisted, looping shape that seemed to pulse with an energy of its own. My blood ran cold, and for a long time, I just sat there, staring at that symbol, too afraid to do anything else. Whatever was out there, it was getting closer. And it wasn't just watching us anymore. Morning came like a sigh of relief, but the uneasy feeling from the night before clung to me like a shadow. I hadn't told anyone about the symbol outside my tent. Part of me wanted to believe it was a dream, trick of the mind brought on by fear and exhaustion. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The others were quiet as we ate breakfast. The usual banter replaced by tense silence. Sarah was the first to speak, her voice trembling as she recounted how she'd heard someone, or something, whispering her name in the night. Chris tried to brush it off, claiming it was just a nightmare, but his eyes betrayed him. We all knew something was wrong. We spent the day trying to shake off the unease. We hiked around the lake, explored some trails, and did our best to distract ourselves. There was no escaping it. Forest, once beautiful and serene, now felt oppressive, like it was closing in on us. Even the sunlight seemed weaker, barely piercing through the dense canopy of trees. As the day wore on, the tension only grew. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig had us jumping, our nerves frayed to the breaking point. By the time the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the campsite, we were all on edge, barely holding it together. That night, we didn't bother with a campfire. No one wanted to be outside after dark, so we retreated to our tents early, hoping to avoid whatever horrors the night might bring. But it was no use. As soon as the darkness settled in, the whispers returned. This time, they were louder, more insistent. They weren't just outside, they were inside my head, crawling through my thoughts like a parasite. It was maddening, like 1,000 voices all speaking at once, none of them making any sense. I tried to cover my ears, to drown them out, but it was no use. The whispers just grew louder, more frantic, until I could barely think. Then, all at once, they stopped. The silence was deafening, more terrifying than the whispers had ever been. I lay there, holding my breath, waiting for something, anything to happen. But the silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. I could hear my own heartbeat, feel the sweat dripping down my face. And then I heard it. A soft, deliberate scratching sound coming from outside my tent. It was faint at first, like someone dragging a stick through the dirt. But it grew louder, more insistent, as if whatever was out there was trying to get in. My mind raced with possibilities. An animal, one of my friends playing a cruel joke. Deep down, I knew it was neither. Gathering what little courage I had, I reached for the flashlight next to my sleeping bag and slowly unzipped the tent, just enough to peer outside. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing the campsite and the source of the sound. There, just a few feet from my tent, was a hand. Pale, bony hand, scratching symbols into the dirt. The same twisted, looping symbols I'd seen the night before. My breath caught in my throat as I followed the hand up, my flashlight revealing more of the figure. It was crouched low, body obscured by shadows, but I could see enough. The skin was unnaturally pale, almost translucent, stretched tight over a gaunt frame. Its head was down, obscured by long, tangled hair, but I could feel its gaze, feel it staring right at me. For a moment I was frozen, paralyzed by fear. Then, as if sensing my terror, figure slowly lifted its head. Flashlight flickered, casting the face in brief, jagged flashes of light. It was a woman, least it had been. Her eyes were hollow, empty sockets that seemed to drink in the darkness. Her mouth twisted into a grin that was all wrong, too wide, too sharp, revealing rows of jagged teeth. She whispered something I couldn't understand, but it filled me with a primal, gut-wrenching fear. I scrambled back, dropping the flashlight as I zipped the tent shut, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The scratching stopped, replaced by a soft, rhythmic tapping on the side of the tent, right next to my head. Tap, tap, tap. Like fingernails gently rapping against the fabric. I clamped my hands over my ears, squeezing my eyes shut, trying to block it all out. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, until it was all I could hear, all I could think about. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, it stopped. Silence. I lay there for what felt like hours, too terrified to move, too terrified to sleep. Eventually exhaustion took over, pulling me into a restless, uneasy slumber. When I woke, the sun was rising, casting long golden rays across the campsite. The symbol was gone, the dirt smooth and undisturbed, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. The woman, whatever she was, had been real, and she wasn't done with us yet. The next morning, we all knew something was terribly wrong. No one had slept well, and the haunted looks in my friends' eyes told me they had their own encounters during the night. But no one wanted to talk about it. What could we say? That we were all being tormented by some nightmare made flesh? It was easier to pretend it was all in our heads, just figments of our imagination, brought on by too much isolation. But we couldn't keep pretending for long. We decided to leave. It didn't matter that it was early, or that we still had a day left on our trip. None of us wanted to spend another night in those woods. We packed up quickly, not talking much, just focused on getting out. The sooner we were back on the road, better. But as we started to pack, we realized something was wrong. Jenna was missing. At first, we thought she was just off somewhere, maybe gathering her things or taking a walk to clear her head. But as the minutes ticked by and there was no sign of her, panic began to set in. We called out for her, our voices echoing through the trees, but there was no response. It was like she had vanished into thin air. The fear that had been simmering beneath the surface all weekend boiled over. We searched the campsite, then the surrounding woods, shouting her name until our throats were raw. But there was nothing. No sign of her. No tracks, no evidence that she had ever been there at all. Chris tried to keep it together, but I could see the fear in his eyes. She couldn't have gone far, he said, more to himself than to any of us. Maybe she's just lost. We'll find her. But I knew better. I knew she wasn't lost. I knew that whatever was out there had taken her. The thought was like ice in my veins, freezing me to the core. We had to get out, but we couldn't leave without Jenna. We couldn't just abandon her. So we kept searching, pushing deeper into the forest, further away from the safety of our cars and the road. The deeper we went, the darker it got. The trees growing closer together, their branches forming a tangled, oppressive canopy overhead. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of damp earth and decay. That's when we heard it, the whispering. Louder this time, like a chorus of voices all around us, echoing off the trees, swirling through the air. We stopped, huddled together, fear gripping us like a vice. Jenna? Sarah called out, her voice shaking. Is that you? The whispering grew louder, more frantic, but there was no answer. Only the voices, rising and falling in a language we couldn't understand. My heart was pounding in my chest, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Then out of the corner of my eye I saw movement. A shadow, just at the edge of my vision, flitting between the trees. I turned to look, and there she was. Jenna, standing in the distance, her back to us, hair hanging loose and tangled down her back. Jenna, I shouted, relief flooding through me. I started towards her, but Sarah grabbed my arm, holding me back. Wait, she whispered, her voice filled with terror. Something's wrong. I looked again, my relief turning to dread. Jenna wasn't moving. She was just standing there, perfectly still, her head slightly tilted to one side, like she was listening to something. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I realized they were coming from her. "Jenna?" I called out again, but she didn't respond. She didn't turn around. She just stood there, whispering to the trees, to the darkness. I took a step closer, but then she moved. It was sudden, jerky, like a puppet yanked on strings. She turned to face us, and my blood ran cold. Her eyes were gone. In their place were empty sockets, black as the void, staring straight through me. Her mouth twisted into that same horrible grin I'd seen on the woman last night, too wide, too sharp, filled with those same jagged teeth. The whispering grew louder, spilling from her lips in a twisted, inhuman chant. We all froze, paralyzed by fear. For a long, terrible moment, we just stood there, staring at the thing that had once been Jenna. And then, without warning, she or it screamed. The sound was unlike anything I'd ever heard. High-pitched, unnatural, like the wail of a dying animal mixed with the screech of metal tearing against metal. It was a sound that cut through the air, through my mind, leaving me reeling, disoriented. And then she lunged at us. The spell broke. We turned and ran, forest a blur around us as we sprinted back towards the campsite, towards the cars, towards anything that could get us away from that thing. I could hear her behind us, crashing through the underbrush, the whispering, now a deafening roar, filling my head, drowning out everything else. We reached the campsite, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I didn't care about the gear we left behind, or the fire we hadn't bothered to extinguish. All I cared about was getting to the car, getting out of those woods before whatever had taken Jenna took the rest of us. We piled into the car, Chris fumbling with the keys, his hands shaking so badly he could barely get them into the ignition. Finally, the engine roared to life, and we tore out of there, tires kicking up dirt as we sped down the road, away from the forest, away from the horror that lurked within. No one spoke the entire drive back. We were all too shaken, too terrified to put what we'd seen into words. When we finally reached civilization, we went our separate ways. Too afraid to even look at each other, too afraid to confront the reality of what had happened. Jenna was never found. They sent search parties into the woods, but all they found was our abandoned campsite, our gear scattered, fire long dead. There was no sign of her, no trace of the thing that had taken her, but I know she's still out there. I can still hear the whispering, late at night, when the world is quiet and the darkness closes in. I hear it calling my name, beckoning me back to the forest, back to the place where it all began, and I know one day I won't be able to resist. We had been planning this camping trip for weeks, a much-needed escape from the grind of city life. It was supposed to be a weekend of laughter, cheap beer, and stories around the campfire. Just me and 3 of my closest friends, surrounded by nothing but nature. The drive to the campsite was longer than expected. The narrow road twisted and turned through dense forests that seemed to grow thicker with every mile. By the time we arrived, the sun was already dipping below the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows across the ground. We found a spot near a small clearing, the perfect place to set up camp, or so we thought. The air was still, almost too still, and there was a strange quietness that hung over the place. No birds chirping, no insects buzzing, just the soft rustle of leaves as a faint breeze passed through the trees. As we unpacked the car and started setting up our tents, couldn't shake this weird feeling. It was like we were intruding. We weren't supposed to be there. But I shrugged it off. I mean, it's just a forest, right? And we were here to have fun, not to let our imaginations run wild. By the time we got the fire going, night had fully settled in. The flames flickered and danced, casting a warm glow that didn't quite reach the darkness beyond. We cracked open our beers and started telling the usual stories. Half-remembered ghost tales, urban legends, kind of stuff meant to freak each other out. But I could tell, deep down, that the stories weren't the only thing giving me chills. There was something else. Presence, maybe? Or just the overwhelming sense that we were being watched. I tried to shake it off, but it kept gnawing at me. This inexplicable unease that I couldn't explain. At one point, I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, just beyond the fire's light, a shadow that didn't belong to any of us. But when I turned to look, there was nothing. Just trees swaying gently in the breeze, their branches creaking like old bones. "You all right, man?" Jack asked, noticing my distraction. "Yeah," I replied, forcing a smile. "Just tired, I guess." But I wasn't tired. I was on edge, every nerve in my body screaming that something was off. The others didn't seem to notice. They were too wrapped up in their stories and the warmth of the fire. But as the night wore on, that feeling of dread only grew stronger. And deep down I knew we weren't alone in these woods. As the fire crackled and our laughter echoed through the trees, the night seemed to stretch on forever. But that strange feeling, the sense that we weren't alone, kept gnawing at me. I tried to push it aside, but it clung to me like a cold sweat. It wasn't long before the first of the strange sounds began. At first, it was just the occasional snap of a twig or rustling of leaves. Normal forest noises, I told myself. But then it became more persistent, more deliberate, like something, or someone, was moving out there in the darkness. I glanced at the others, but they seemed oblivious, still caught up in their stories. I didn't want to be the one to ruin the mood, so I kept quiet, straining my ears to listen. The noises grew louder, closer. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to locate the source, but it was impossible to tell where it was coming from. It was like the forest itself was alive, surrounding us with unseen eyes. And then, out of nowhere, came the whispers. They were faint at first, barely audible over the crackling fire. But as I listened, they became clearer, as if someone was speaking just beyond the tree line. It wasn't just one voice, it was several, overlapping in a haunting chorus of words I couldn't understand. My skin crawled and I felt a shiver run down my spine. "Did you guys hear that?" I finally blurted out, unable to keep the fear from creeping into my voice. They stopped talking, and for a moment, the only sound was the crackling of the fire. Everyone strained to listen, but the whispers had already faded back into the night. "You're what?" Sarah asked, brow furrowed. "Voices," I said, barely above a whisper. "Like whispers." Jack chuckled, shaking his head. "Man, you're just freaking yourself out with the wind." But it wasn't the wind. I knew that, and deep down, I think they knew it too. Because after that, the atmosphere changed. The laughter died down, and an uneasy silence settled over us. Even the fire seemed to burn a little dimmer. We sat there for a while, just listening, but the whispers didn't come back. Instead, there was something else. Presence, heavy and oppressive, like the air was thick with it. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, and every time I looked into the darkness, I half expected to see something staring back at me. Then, just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, James suddenly stood up, his eyes wide with fear. "Did you guys see that?" he asked, his voice trembling. "See what?" Sarah asked, her voice tight with anxiety. "Over there," he said, pointing into the darkness beyond the fire's reach. "I swear, I saw something move." We all stared in the direction he was pointing, but there was nothing there, just shadows and trees. But the fear in James's voice was contagious, and soon we were all on edge, every small noise sending our hearts racing. I could feel the fear settling in, deep and cold. It was the kind of fear that gnaws at your sanity, that makes you question what's real and what's just your mind playing tricks on you. And as the night dragged on, that fear only grew stronger, feeding on the darkness around us. The forest, once a place of calm, had become a living nightmare. And somewhere out there, in the inky blackness, something was watching us. Waiting, we all tried to convince ourselves that we were just imagining things, that the shadows and whispers were nothing more than our minds playing tricks. But deep down, we knew something was wrong. The night had taken on a sinister edge, and the air was thick with a sense of impending doom. It was sometime after midnight when the real horror began. I was jolted awake by a sharp cold pressure on my chest, like something heavy was pressing down on me. My eyes shot open, and for a moment, I couldn't move. Panic surged through me as I realized I couldn't breathe, like the air had been sucked out of my lungs. And then I saw it, a shadowy figure standing at the edge of the campsite, just beyond the reach of the firelight. It was tall and thin, its outline barely discernible in the darkness. But even without seeing its face, I could feel its eyes on me, burning into my soul with a malevolence that froze me to the core. I wanted to scream, to warn the others, couldn't make a sound. Pressure on my chest grew stronger, and for a moment, I thought I was going to die right there, brushed by this unseen force. But then, as suddenly as it had come, the pressure lifted, and I gasped for air, my lungs burning as I finally managed to sit up. Figure was gone, vanished into the night, as if it had never been there. But I knew what I'd seen, and the fear that had been simmering inside me exploded into full-blown terror. I scrambled out of my tent, my heart racing, and found the others already awake, their faces pale and eyes wide with fear. They had heard it too, those eerie whispers, growing louder and more insistent, like a chorus of voices surrounding us. But it wasn't just the whispers. There was something else, something moving in the darkness. "Did you see it?" I asked, my voice trembling. James nodded, his face ashen. Yeah, I saw something. It was right there, watching us." Before I could respond, a loud crash echoed through the forest, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and coming straight toward us. We all froze, our eyes locked on the darkness beyond the firelight. Footsteps grew louder, closer, until they were just on the edge of the clearing. And then, silence. For a moment, none of us moved. We barely even breathed, waiting for whatever it was to reveal itself. But the silence stretched on, thick and suffocating, until it was almost unbearable. My mind raced with possibilities, animals, other campers, maybe just our imaginations running wild. But deep down, I knew it wasn't any of those things. Just as I was about to suggest we leave, something cold brushed against my neck. I flinched and spun around. There was nothing there, just empty air. My skin prickled with goosebumps, and a cold sweat broke out on my forehead. The air around us had dropped several degrees, and the fire that had once seemed so warm and comforting now flickered weakly, as if struggling to stay alive. "We need to go," Dara whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of my own heart. "We need to get out of here, now." No one argued. We hurriedly began packing up our things, our hands shaking so badly it was hard to even zip up the bags. But just as we were about to leave, we heard it, a child's laughter, soft and echoing through the trees. It was the most unnerving sound I'd ever heard. Innocent yet wrong. It didn't belong here, in the middle of the night, in the middle, nowhere. "Who the hell is that?" Jack whispered, his voice tight with fear, but no one had an answer. We all just stood there, paralyzed by the sound as it grew louder, closer. The laughter was soon joined by other voices, soft, distant cries that seemed to come from every direction at once. My heart pounded in my chest and my breath came in short, panicked gasps. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. We were surrounded. Panic took hold of us. The laughter echoed through the trees, growing louder, more frenzied, as if the forest itself was mocking our fear. We grabbed our bags, abandoning anything that couldn't be carried, and started running. Fire sputtered out behind us, plunging the campsite into darkness. We had no idea where we were going. Just away from that horrible laughter, those voices that seemed to surround us. The trees closed in on us, their branches like skeletal hands reaching out to drag us back into the nightmare we were fleeing. Every step felt like we were sinking deeper into a maze with no way out. "Where the hell are we?" Sarah gasped, her voice on the edge of hysteria. "I don't know," Jack shouted back, his voice raw with fear. "Just keep moving." But the forest wasn't letting us go that easily. No matter how far we ran, the voices followed, always just out of sight, but close enough to chill our blood. And then, the trees began to thin, and we stumbled into a small clearing. That's when we saw it, the cabin. It was old, decrepit, as if it had been abandoned for decades. The wood was rotting, the windows shattered, and the roof sagged in the middle. But there was something about it, something that drew us in despite every instinct screaming at us to run in the opposite direction. "We can't go in there," I whispered, but even as I said it, I knew we had no choice. Whatever was out there in the woods was closing in, and the cabin was our only option. Without a word, we all moved toward it, our footsteps crunching on the dead leaves that littered the ground. The door creaked ominously as we pushed it open, and a wave of cold air rushed out to greet us, carrying with it the scent of decay and something far worse. Inside, the cabin was just as dilapidated as the outside. Floor was covered in dirt and debris, and strange symbols were carved into the walls. Symbols that looked ancient, filled with a dark power that made my skin crawl. "We shouldn't be here," James said, voice trembling. "This place? It's wrong." He was right. Everything about the cabin felt wrong, like it was a living, breathing entity that had been waiting for us, drawing us in like flies to a spider's web. But before we could turn back, the door slammed shut behind us with a force that shook the entire structure. We were trapped. The air grew thick, suffocating, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to twist and writhe, forming shapes that defied explanation. The whispers started again, louder now, and this time they were coming from inside the cabin. I turned to the others. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide with terror. Sarah was muttering under her breath, her gaze fixed on something only she could see. Jack and James were backing away from the center of the room, their expressions a mix of confusion and horror. Then, in the dim light filtering through the broken windows, I saw it. A large, crude altar at the far end of the room. It was covered in dark stains that looked too old to be recent, but too fresh to be forgotten, and on it lay something that made my blood run cold. A human skull, cracked and yellowed with age, surrounded by the same symbols that were carved into the walls. "This isn't real," whispered, shaking my head. "This can't be real." But it was real. The voices were louder now, chanting in a language that made my head throb, my vision blur. And then, as if drawn by some unseen force, the shadows began to converge on the altar, swirling around it like a vortex of darkness. I couldn't move. None of us could. We were rooted to the spot, forced to watch as the shadows coalesced into a single towering figure. It was the same figure I'd seen at the campsite, but now it was fully formed, a monstrous silhouette with glowing eyes that burned with a malevolent intelligence. Spoke. The words were incomprehensible, a guttural language that made my ears ring and my stomach churn. The temperature dropped even further, and I could see my breath in the frigid air. The thing moved closer, its presence so overwhelming that it felt like the cabin itself was shrinking around us. "Leave us alone," Jack shouted, but his voice was swallowed by the darkness. The figure reached out, its hand, or what passed for a hand, hovering over the skull on the altar. The symbols on the walls began to glow, pulsing with a sickly light, and the chanting grew louder, more frenzied. I could feel it pulling at me, drawing the life out of my body, draining my very essence. And then, as quickly as it had begun, everything stopped. The chanting ceased, the light faded, and the figure vanished, leaving behind only silence and the oppressive cold. We stood there, trembling, too scared to move or even speak. The door creaked open on its own, revealing the dark forest outside, now eerily quiet. The voices were gone, the laughter silenced, but the sense of dread lingered, heavy and suffocating. Without a word, we fled the cabin, running blindly into the night, desperate to escape the nightmare that had ensnared us. The trees parted as we ran, and somehow we found ourselves back at the campsite. The fire was dead, the tents torn to shreds. We didn't stop, we didn't look back. We just kept running, all the way back to the car, praying that whatever was in those woods wasn't following us. As we drove away, the forest loomed behind us, dark and foreboding, as if it was watching us leave. I knew, deep down, that we had been lucky to escape with our lives. But that night has haunted me ever since. And I can still hear those whispers when I close my eyes, calling me back to the cabin, back to the horror that waits in the woods. And I know, one day, I won't be able to resist. We were looking for an escape, a weekend away from the grind of everyday life. Just a few friends, a few beers, and the open wilderness. Sounded perfect. Mike had found the place, an old campsite deep in the forest, miles away from the nearest town. No cell service, no distractions, just the four of us and the trees. It was supposed to be peaceful. It wasn't. The moment we arrived, I felt it. The air was thick with something I couldn't quite place. It wasn't just the silence, though that was unnerving enough. No birds, no wind, nothing but the crunch of our boots on the dried leaves. It was more than that. The place felt wrong. But I pushed it aside. We all did. We set up our tents, lit the fire, and by the time the sun started to dip below the horizon, we were laughing, sharing ghost stories, and trying to outdo each other with who could make the creepiest shadow puppets in the firelight. That's when the first odd thing happened. We heard it. Faint, almost a whisper. It sounded like footsteps just beyond the tree line. I stopped mid-sentence, my eyes scanning the darkness, but there was nothing. Mike joked about it being Bigfoot, and we all laughed it off, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. As the night wore on, the firelight cast long, flickering shadows across the campsite. Every crackle of the fire made me jump. The wind had picked up, but it wasn't like any wind I'd felt before. It was cold, biting, and it seemed to carry with it the faintest hint of voices. I told myself it was just my imagination, but then Sarah screamed. We all whipped around to see her standing at the edge of the campsite, her flashlight pointed into the woods. "I saw someone," she said, her voice trembling. "Right there, behind that tree." We rushed over, but there was nothing, no sign of anyone. Still, Sarah was convinced, swearing that she'd seen a figure, tall, shadowy figure standing just beyond the reach of the light, watching us. That was when I first started to feel the dread. It crept up on me like a shadow, a cold, icy grip around my heart. I tried to laugh it off, but every instinct screamed at me. Something was wrong. We all felt it. The laughter faded, replaced by an uneasy silence. The fire seemed smaller, the darkness around us thicker, more oppressive. We decided to call it a night, retreating to the safety of our tents. But as I zipped up my sleeping bag, couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. I lay there, staring at the nylon ceiling of my tent, listening to the sounds of the forest. Or rather, the lack of them. The usual hum of nocturnal life was absent, replaced by an eerie stillness. Then I heard it again, footsteps, this time closer, circling the campsite. I held my breath, straining to listen. There was no mistaking it. Something was out there, something moving slowly, deliberately, just beyond the light. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears. And then from somewhere deep within the forest I heard a voice. A low, raspy whisper that sent chills down my spine. Called my name. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing as that voice, a voice that should have been impossible to hear, whispered my name again, softer this time, but unmistakable. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, just my mind playing tricks on me. Deep down I knew that wasn't true. I squeezed my eyes shut, as if that would make it go away, but the darkness behind my eyelids only amplified the sounds outside. Footsteps grew louder, closer. My breath hitched in my throat. I could hear it moving around the tent, slow and deliberate, crunching leaves underfoot. I didn't dare move. My heart was hammering so hard, I was sure whoever, or whatever, was out there could hear it. And then, in the middle of that oppressive silence, something brushed against the side of my tent. It was a light touch, almost gentle, like someone running their fingers along the fabric. I gasped, unable to help myself, and the touch stopped. For a moment, everything went completely still. I lay there, paralyzed, waiting for what felt like an eternity. Then, all at once, the night exploded with noise. It started with a low, guttural growl, coming from right outside my tent. The kind of sound that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. I heard it again, closer this time. Something was circling us, snarling, growling, like a predator playing with its prey. The footsteps were back, heavier now, accompanied by that same low, menacing growl. Suddenly, Mike's voice cut through the chaos, shouting from his tent. "Did you hear that? What the hell was that?" His voice was shaky, filled with the same terror I was feeling. "I don't know," I whispered back, not trusting myself to speak any louder. "But it's out there, Mike. It's right outside." Sarah started crying softly, her voice muffled by the fabric of her tent. "We need to leave. We need to leave right now." But there was no way we were going out there, not with that thing prowling around. I could hear it still, moving between our tents, snarling and growling, as if trying to decide which one of us to attack first. Then, just as quickly as it started, the noises stopped. Silence fell over the campsite again, thick and suffocating. I didn't move. I barely breathed. For a long time there was nothing but that horrible, tense silence. I thought maybe, just maybe, it had gone away. But then, I heard it again. That whisper, chilling and clear, coming from just inches away. "I see you." I snapped my eyes open, my blood running cold. The voice was right outside my tent, close enough that I could almost feel its breath on my skin. My mind raced, desperately trying to make sense of it. This wasn't possible. Couldn't be real. But it was. And it was getting closer. I held my breath, waiting for the tent to rip open, for whatever was out there to drag me into the darkness. But instead, I heard footsteps retreating. Slowly, deliberately, whatever it was started walking away, back into the woods. The sounds grew fainter, and then they were gone. I waited for what felt like hours before I finally dared to move. When I did, I crawled out of my tent as quietly as I could, flashlight in hand, and found the others doing the same. We gathered around the dying campfire, our faces pale, our hands trembling. "Did anyone else hear it?" Mike asked, voice barely a whisper. We all nodded. None of us had any answers, only the same sickening fear that whatever had just happened was far from over. Sarah looked around, her eyes wide and fearful. "What was it?" she asked, her voice shaking. "What the hell was that?" No one answered, because deep down, we all knew that whatever was out there wasn't human. And it wasn't done with us yet. We huddled around the dying embers of the fire, cold seeping into our bones. None of us dared to speak above a whisper, as if raising our voices might summon whatever horror had stalked our campsite. Forest around us was silent again, but it wasn't the comforting stillness of night. It was an oppressive, waiting silence. The woods themselves were holding their breath. Mike was the first to break the tension, his voice low and trembling. "We can't stay here. We have to leave now before it comes back." "Are you insane?" Dara shot back, her eyes wide with fear. "We can't go out there. It's in the woods, waiting for us." "Then what do you suggest?" Mike snapped, its fear sharpening into anger. "We just sit here and wait for it to pick us off, one by one?" I could see the desperation in their eyes, the same panic that was threatening to overwhelm me, but I couldn't let it. I had to think. I had to find a way out of this. "Listen," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "If we stick together, we have a better chance. We make a run for the car and drive the hell out of here. It's our only shot." They nodded, though I could see the doubt in their faces. We packed up as quickly as we could, hands shaking, every rustle of the trees making us jump. The fire had nearly burned out, leaving us in near total darkness, only our flashlights to pierce the blackness. We started down the narrow trail that led back to the car, our footsteps echoing unnaturally loud in the silence. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves had us whipping around, half expecting to see some nightmarish figure lunging at us. But there was nothing, just the dark, endless forest and our own ragged breaths. Then, halfway down the trail, the noises started again. At first it was distant, almost imperceptible. Faint rustling in the bushes, crack of a branch, but it quickly grew louder, closer, like something was crashing through the underbrush, coming straight for us. We stopped dead in our tracks, our flashlights sweeping wildly through the trees, but we couldn't see anything. "Run!" Mike yelled, panic finally taking over. We took off down the trail, our flashlights bobbing wildly as we stumbled over roots and rocks, our breath coming in gasps. The sound of something pursuing us grew louder, closer, a cacophony of breaking branches and guttural growls. I could feel it gaining on us, could almost feel its breath on the back of my neck. I didn't dare look back. We burst out of the trees into a small clearing, and that's when I saw it, just for a split second. A shadowy figure, tall and twisted, with glowing eyes that seemed to pierce straight through me. I tripped, falling hard to the ground. My flashlight flew out of my hand, spinning across the dirt. I scrambled to my feet, panic clawing at my throat, but it was too late. The thing was right behind me, its growl reverberating through the air, a sound that was more than just noise. It was pure, unadulterated malice. Mike grabbed my arm, yanking me to my feet, and we kept running, terror giving us a speed we didn't know we had. We could see the car now, just up ahead, but it felt impossibly far. The growls were deafening now, surrounding us, as if there were more than one of those things, closing in from all sides. We reached the car, practically throwing ourselves inside. Mike fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking so badly he almost dropped them. Come on, Sarah screamed, slamming her fist against the dashboard. Finally, the engine roared to life and Mike slammed his foot on the gas. The tires spun in the dirt for a terrifying moment before we lurched forward, speeding down the narrow road, away from the campsite, away from whatever had been hunting us. But as we raced down that dark, winding road, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Whatever was out there in those woods wasn't finished with us yet. And when I glanced in the rearview mirror, I swore I saw those glowing eyes staring back at me. Just for a moment. before they disappeared into the darkness. We drove in silence, the adrenaline still coursing through our veins. Only sound the hum of the engine and our ragged breathing. The trees whipped past us in a blur, and every shadow felt like it was reaching for us, ready to drag us back into the nightmare we'd just escaped. But we didn't stop. We couldn't. It felt like if we stopped, whatever was out there would catch up to us, would drag us back to that cursed place. No one spoke. What was there to say? How could we explain what had happened, what we had seen? We were too scared to make sense of it, too shaken to try. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those glowing eyes again, following us, getting closer. But the road behind us remained empty. Just a stretch of dark, twisting asphalt disappearing into the trees. Finally, after what felt like hours, we reached the edge of the forest, the road widening as we approached the highway. The sight of the open road ahead brought a wave of relief, but it was short-lived. As we slowed down, trying to catch our breath and figure out what to do next, the car suddenly jerked to the side, engine sputtering. No, no, no. Mike cursed, slamming his foot on the gas, but the car just shuddered, grinding to a halt on the shoulder. We sat there in stunned silence, the reality of our situation crashing down on us. We were stranded, in the middle of nowhere, with God knows what lurking out there in the darkness. What the hell is happening? Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. I don't know, Mike said, his voice flat. Beat it. Bar just died. I looked around, my heart sinking. The highway was deserted. No lights, no cars, nothing but the endless stretch of road and the encroaching darkness. And that's when I noticed it. The air had changed. It was colder now, unnaturally so, and the familiar scent of pine and earth was gone, replaced by a sickly sweet smell that turned my stomach. We can't stay here, I said, trying to keep the panic from creeping into my voice. We need to get out, walk if we have to. But as I reached for the door handle, I saw it again, those eyes. They were there, just beyond the reach of our headlights, glowing with that same malevolent light. I froze, my hand hovering over the handle, my heart pounding in my chest. Do you see that? I whispered, my voice barely audible. They all turned to look, and the gasps that followed told me they saw it too. The eyes were closer now, moving towards us slowly, deliberately, like a predator stalking its prey. And then we heard it. The voice. That same low, rasping whisper that had haunted me in the tent, now louder, more insistent. Come back. It wasn't a request. It was a command, and it sent a wave of pure terror through me. The air inside the car grew colder, frost creeping across the windows, and I could feel it, an overwhelming sense of dread, like the very life was being sucked out of me. We need to go, I said, my voice trembling. Now. We scrambled out of the car, our breaths visible in the freezing air, and took off down the highway, running as fast as we could. But the voice followed us, growing louder, more desperate, as if the forest itself was calling us back. Don't leave. The temperature dropped even further, our breath freezing in our throats. But we kept running. The road stretched out before us, endless and empty, and I realized with a sinking heart that we weren't going to make it. Whatever it wasn't going to let us go. Then, up ahead, we saw lights, headlights, coming towards us. We screamed, waving our arms, desperate for help, and the car slowed to a stop. A man rolled down his window, his face a mix of confusion and concern. Are you kids okay? He asked. Please, help us. Dara cried, tears streaming down her face. There's something out there. We need to get away. The man's face grew serious, and he motioned for us to get in. We piled into his car, slamming the doors shut behind us, and he sped off, the headlights of our abandoned car disappearing in the rearview mirror. What happened back there? The man asked, glancing at us with worried eyes. None of us could answer. What could we say? That we had been hunted by some malevolent force? A thing that shouldn't exist? That we had seen something in those woods that defied explanation? Before we could even try to explain, the man spoke again, his voice low and somber. You're lucky you got out, he said. Not everyone does. That forest, it's not like other places. It's alive. It takes people. Always has. A chill ran down my spine as his words sank in. He wasn't just some random guy who had stopped to help. He knew exactly what was out there, and he knew that we had barely escaped with our lives. As we drove further from the forest, the tension slowly began to fade, but the fear never truly left. Even as the trees thinned out and the lights of a small town appeared on the horizon, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. That those eyes, that voice, would haunt me forever. We never spoke about what happened that night. Not to each other, not to anyone. It was as if saying it out loud would make it real, bring it back. But I still see it, in my nightmares, those glowing eyes and that voice whispering in the dark. And sometimes, late at night, I wake up and swear I can hear it still, faint and distant, calling me back to the forest. Come back. But I never will. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed these chilling stories as much as I enjoyed sharing them with you. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the channel and give us a thumbs up to keep the terror coming. Your support means the world to us and helps us bring even more spine-tingling content your way. Before you go, don't forget to check out the video playing on the screen. It's packed with more unsettling tales and eerie experiences that you won't want to miss. If you have any frightening stories of your own or suggestions for future content, drop them in the comments below. Stay tuned for more haunting adventures. Until next time, sleep tight. You can.